Racism and Leadership for Executive Women of Color. We'll give you just a few moments to join in and to get comfortable. Today's fireside chat is going to be incredible. We have none other than Dr. Claire with us, the Executive Director of National Association of Social Workers, New York City chapter, and she is no stranger to iRaise. She has been with us throughout the years, very vocal on these types of issues. So, Dr. Claire, thank you so much for joining today and for being with me.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me back.
Absolutely. Well, we got some really, really important things to talk about. So first things first, if you are watching this right now, whether you're watching on your lunch break or you're watching this later on, we do want to elevate this message. So do us a favor and share this message out. You can press the share button if you're watching on Facebook. And if you're watching on LinkedIn, just repost it so your networks can see it. We do want to make sure that we continue to amplify messages that are positive, to ensure that our families and our communities receive this information. So again, we thank you all so much for joining us today for this 30-minute segment. I'm going to jump into Dr. Claire's bio, and then we're going to jump into some really great questions. So stay with us until the end. Dr. Claire Green-Forde is an award-winning, highly sought-after mental health and racial and social justice thought leader, speaker and practitioner and advocate with an unapologetic approach grounded in health equity and an unwavering commitment to justice. She leads with passion, curiosity, and authenticity. Dr. Claire is a licensed clinical social worker whose work and interests focus on the intersection of behavioral health, racial and social disparities, criminal justice, trauma, and human development. She is a firm believer in the biopsychosocial spiritual model of wellness and is a strong advocate for for holistic and culturally humble practices that consider both a trauma and healing informed lens. Dr. Green-Forde has a portfolio of expertise which spans adolescent and adult mental health, advocacy and policy, health equity, bullying, criminal and juvenile justice, women's rights, organizational development, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. And in her professional capacities, Dr. Green-Forde serves as the executive director, as I mentioned earlier, for the NASW New York City chapter. And separately, Dr. Claire Green-Forde is the founder and CEO of Dr. Claire Speaks. I'm really excited about that, LLC, which is a consultancy dedicated to dismantling systemic inequities in healthcare and promoting organizational wellness. That's just incredible. I know you already, but like reading your bio makes me excited again. So absolutely. So Dr. Claire, you've been doing incredible work over the years. I think you've been with NASW for going on, I want to say 5 years or 6 now.
Yeah.
And you're the executive director. You're leading the charge. In one of the first chapters that has opened, I think, right in our under NASW has been New York City.
It was the first. It was New York City's the first headquarters for NASW when all of the 7 social work organizations came together. NASW New York City was the headquarters for the association.
And you're leading that. It's historical, and it's one of the really one of the most important, not that the other branches aren't chapters of NASW, and you've been doing incredible work there. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what led you into that position and what was your career journey leading up to that.
Yeah, so unapologetically, I lead with my faith, and I would say what led me was God. I was working for New York City government at the time that I learned about this opportunity. I had been speaking on a panel about migration and the challenges being transnational and transnational identities and the intersections that we experience. I am from Barbados. I came here as a tween. And so I've always said that I live between 2 worlds because I left my country as a tween and, my formative years were back home, but then I've been in America. And so I'm not American, but because I left my country, it's like, well, you don't fully fit in here either. So I live between no man's land. And we were having that conversation. And I, through that conversation, learned about this opportunity, applied. I think there was 50 or so applicants, and went through multiple rounds of interviewing with, I think at one time there was 15 people in one of my interviews.
Wow.
And then, yeah, it was a lot. And then, I took the role.
That is incredible. No, I love that. And just your work and how you transitioned into this role. And I know that it's been a ride, and we'll get into that in just a moment. But I'm wondering if you can also speak to some of the unique challenges that you've faced on your journey in leadership. You started talking about it a little bit in your prior role in city government. But what were some of the unique challenges that you faced on that journey to being the executive director of NASW?
I think, like many Black women and many women who have roots in the African diaspora or the global majority in general, it's the lack of sponsorship, the lack of mentorship, the challenges of the assumptions made, right? It's the stereotypes go with us regardless of whether or not we hold them or not, right? There's the
Yeah.
stereotype that we are so exhausted with of the angry Black woman. There's a stereotype that we're all exhausted with the spicy Latina. There's all of these stereotypes that you are burdened with and are thrown upon you. I know that in many of my roles, speaking up was seen as a problem. Speaking up meant that I was challenging authority. I am a forever learner, and I question everything. It drives my husband crazy because I ask a lot of questions, and I'm going to ask questions to the questions if it's not clarified. I'm going to ask for the written policies. I'm going to ask for the procedures.
Yes.
And when you're operating in a lot of spaces, and I can say I've worked in a lot of nonprofits and I've worked in government, a lot of times things are not clearly articulated. They are policies or vague sometimes, or
Absolutely.
practices outweigh the policy. So we've always done it this way. And then you look at the organizational policy and it's like, well, actually, this is not what the book says. But no one knows what the book says because the last time it was updated was 1985. And
Yes.
so I think that when you go through those experiences, it becomes very challenging, particularly for someone like me who is very risk averse, who likes to know the policies, the implications, and also for someone like me who is so firmly grounded in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, that when I see incongruence between the stated values of an association or organization and the way that people are treated, the way that they provide service, I'm going to ask questions, and I'm going to also raise that because as a social worker and as a humanist, I always say I am an unapologetic humanist and intersectional mental health and racial and social justice practitioner, thought leader, speaker, and advocate. And because I carry a lens that honors intersectionality, and because I'm unapologetically humanist, anything that impacts the human condition, anything where people are not being treated fairly, where policies are applied differently depending on who you are, who you're speaking to, I'm going to speak out about it. I tell my friends and family, I literally have visceral reactions, physical reactions to injustice. It's almost as though like I cannot hold this. I have to speak up. I have to say something because if I don't, it's like this weight inside of my chest that's heavy. And I
Mhm.
know what that burden means as an immigrant, as a woman, as a Black woman, as a person with non-apparent disabilities, as a person with multiple intersecting identities. I know what it means to speak up. I have felt the weight of being ostracized or stereotyped and losing roles or opportunities because of speaking up. But I have this burden on my soul that I can't hold it and just abide with injustice or discrimination. And so those are some of the challenges which, as we have talked many times before, are not unique to me as an individual.
Absolutely.
Unfortunately, they are pervasive and deeply damaging not only to our mental health, but our physical well-being and our social functioning.
Oh, Dr. Clay, you talked about this being a part of your soul, essentially. And so I can imagine that this is your call to life. When you talked about feeling that thing physically, if you don't speak up, it's a mandate. It's something that you have to do because you were called into this. And it takes someone really called into this work to do this and to do it in an unapologetic way, because you do it when it's not popular. You do it when you might lose opportunities and people might ostracize you because you are speaking the truth. And not everyone wants to do that. People want to do, essentially, they want to go with the status quo. And
Mhm.
if it's not popular, not a lot of people are willing to stand out. And so I've always admired how you've always stood your ground, of you always stood out, regardless of whatever the repercussions would be. You've always stood firm on your belief, and I love that about you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, let's go deeper. Last week we had Dr. Ray King, who talked about the unique challenges that Black women face that are in executive positions. And in her dissertation, she actually focused on the organization, the workplace, and how
Mhm.
workplaces were essentially traumatizing for Black women,
Mhm.
and especially those in executive and leadership positions. So essentially, we say things like, shatter the glass ceiling. But what happens once we get into these roles and these positions? Are we treated fairly? Are we given the same opportunity? Do we have access to the same connections? And in her research, she found that we don't, which is not a shock to us. So I'm wondering if you can actually go deeper into that and tell me what your thoughts are around that and what your experiences are around that, as well as a Black woman executive director.
Yeah, thank you so much. So first, shout out to Dr. King because she's super awesome, super dope, fangirl over here,
Yes.
amazing human being. I remember when we did the panel together a few years ago, her light,
Yes.
her spirit, just I've never forgotten her energy. And so big shout out to her. And I am so honored to be able to speak to some of her research and use my personal experiences, which to your point is it's not just unique to me because clearly the research was not just with one individual. And so,
Right.
yeah, I think the overall thing that I will say and then drill down and I can use some examples is that being a Black woman in this space is incredibly traumatic and harmful. I have certainly
Yes.
experienced a lot of physical and mental dis-ease as a result of my experiences and organizational climates. I've been asked to speak about this before, and because I do center outside of my role that we talked about through Dr. Claire Speaks, I center, anti-racist practice within healthcare and healthcare education, advancing social and racial justice, and fostering organizational wellness. I have to speak about the impact of experiences of discrimination, othering, being ostracized, stereotyped on the overall physical and mental health of
Mm.
the people who are experiencing it. Because we have more than enough research to suggest, particularly given the Surgeon General's report that came out last November, Workplace Wellness in the Workplace, specifically talking about the fact that over 80% of people talked about the fact that at least one of their mental health conditions was related to their work environment. And
Wow.
of that, over 75%, if I'm remembering correctly, spoke to the fact that directly experiencing these harms within their workplace have resulted in their dis-ease. So over
Wow.
80% of people are identifying that their workplace is at least in part contributing to their mental dis-ease.
Wow.
And we know there's the strong connection between mental health and our physical and well-being, right? The,
Absolutely.
the onset of autoimmune disorders or exacerbation of hypertension, diabetes, all these things
Yes.
are very strongly linked to anxiety and depression. Go with anxiety, poor sleep issues, migraines, all of these for some women, and there's research that's been coming out, fertility issues, all of
Yep.
these things, because when we think about the
Absolutely.
allostatic load, the body's ability to handle the demand of stress being outweighed by the stress that you're experiencing, the system breaks down, the body breaks down. And in
Yes.
my experiences, I've said and shared openly, I have been in nonprofit healthcare and government my entire career. I have never worked in an organization that has valued my humanity. I have never worked in
Mhm.
an organization where I was not uh, subject to discrimination, targeting for speaking up. I have never worked in an organization where I have been safe to be myself.
Wow.
And I have been in what people assume to be the healing space, right? Because people
Mhm.
assume nonprofit and social service and healthcare to be healing. And I have experienced extreme harm.
Wow.
And when I speak to my circle of friends, my girlfriends, my Black and brown sister circle, as I call them, it's the same, whether it's been in the corporate healthcare setting, whether it's been in the nonprofit setting, whether it's been in criminal justice, whether it has been in child welfare, or literally acute outpatient mental health or hospital mental health. All of us have very similar experiences of being harmed, of having to fight and say, that's not what I said, or
Absolutely.
correct the assumption. So I have experienced a lot of that, and it's been incredibly damaging. And honestly, sometimes I've questioned, do I continue in this? Because it's not worth it. It's very low paying. You're not respected, you're not valued, and you're being abused. And so I think
Absolutely.
those are what, and I'm sure that even though I haven't read Dr. King's work, I'm sure that some of the things I'm sharing are directly correlated to the findings of her study.
Absolutely. No, and I love and appreciate your full transparency on this topic. And you're absolutely correct. And I think the research targeted about over 300 Black women executives. And so you are certainly not the only one that is accounting to the harm psychologically and physically that it has on our body or on our minds as we're in these spaces. I think about, of course, I got to always point back to slavery because that's, essentially a lot of the harm of the what we endured over generations. I think about the way Black women were treated there, and one of the things
Mhm,
that Dr. Ray said that really stuck out to me was that Black women, from the time that we walked into this country, had to work, or from the time that our foot stepped on these lands, we were mandated by the law to work. It was not an option. And what that means, white women, um, they didn't have that mandate. They
mhm,
were taken care of by their husbands. They didn't have to work. Whereas Black women were forced. We had
mhm,
no choice. You were Black, you were a woman, you had to work. And so, what that means and how workplaces have always been harmful for us. And essentially, we've had to just take it. We've had to just deal with it. And
mhm,
we haven't been seen as human. We've been stripped of humanity. And so I think it's so important that we call it for what it is, unapologetically, without, trying to make people feel comfortable, and
mhm,
just say it. I have been psychologically harmed in this place, right, in this workspace. And the dichotomy, I guess our irony of this is that we're in spaces that are supposed to be healing, like you
mhm.
said, nonprofit space, the space where social workers are in, and other helping professions. Why is this showing up there? If any place, we should be the ones leading the charge to dismantle these types of inequities.
Absolutely. But I think it goes back to the roots, right? I always say America's love affair with racism and
Mm,
ongoing denial of its relationship with racism mean that these things will continue to happen. It is
absolutely.
a such a long standing history of these oppressive systems. When we
Yeah.
think, and you mentioned slavery, the Black woman's body and
Mm,
the woman that was used to be a worker was also sexually assaulted and abused and
absolutely.
seen as just a piece of whatever.
Mm,
And that person was also, and her children were also murdered and assaulted
mm,
by the white women over who were married to the overseers or the plantation owners. And there
mm,
were laws introduced to pretty much excuse the murder of Black children at typically because of the hands of, of white women at that time.
for
Then
real.
we look also, the same thing
Mm,
happened to indigenous women, right? And the same
yeah.
thing happened to Hispanic women. The same thing has happened over and over again. But it's the root is the anti-Black racism, which said, and the taxonomy and hierarchy of race, which is a social construct, right? Because we have
Absolutely.
more than enough research to suggest that, or not even to suggest, to confirm that
Yeah.
race is a social construct, that
Absolutely.
the evolution of our skin color had more to do with where people live geographically on Earth than any other differences. But
That's
we've had research in the past by doctors, by practitioners, by leaders, by politicians, by presidents who supported the dehumanizing of groups of people for centuries. So we can't go and say we've done this or America has done this for well over 400 years. If we actually go back, it's more like 500-600 years.
Absolutely.
And now in the last 50 years,
Yes.
so 10% of the time, we've been now talking about justice. Well,
Mm,
that's not going to happen because it's so deeply ingrained that the Black woman is the person that all of your burdens are cast on and is going to make it better for you.
that's
The
right.
Black woman is the person that there's research to say that clearly articulates this as well. The glass cliff, right? And the glass ceiling, right? But more specifically, the glass cliff, which speaks about the fact that typically women, and particularly Black women and women of the global majority, are brought into failing organizations, not supported, not
That's
helped,
right.
and then expected to somehow do a miracle. And when they're not able to do the miracle, because in my belief, the only person that can do miracles is Jesus, and I'm
That's
not
right.
Jesus, they're not able to do
Mhm.
that, then that justifies that this person and this entire race isn't qualified to do it. But we don't look at the fact that we set this person up to fail from the
That's so
beginning.
good.
We don't
That's
look at
so
the
good.
fact that this person has not been mentored, does not receive sponsorship, is not able to access the same funding or
Mm,
the networks, as particularly when we
so
think
good,
of
Dr.
philanthropy and those spaces. We know that Black women are not able to get into the same spaces. When we look at venture capital, right? We know that less than 1% of these millions of dollars, numbers that I can't even write, are going to Black people. We know that of
Mm,
all the millions of dollars, 2%, if that, of Black businesses are going to receive any type of financial support.
under 1%.
And exactly. And we also know that from all the research, and we think about the Deloitte's and the Harvard Business Review and Lean In and McKinsey reports, that Black women are more likely to say that they do not receive mentorship and support in the workplace, and there's no one that advocates for them. And they're also more likely to say that they experience multiple incidences of, I don't call it microaggressions because there's nothing micro about it,
Right.
straight up aggression and dehumanization every single day.
Mm,
And then these are the same Black women that we tell, raise the money, fix the problem, do everything that the board wants you to do the program, we're cutting your funding, we're cutting your staff, we're cutting all this,
oh my
but you're still
goodness.
supposed to do miracles. Oh, and if you say that you're not well, then we question your ability to do this work. And
Mm,
it's a matter now of your character and your ability, not the fact that nothing is set up for you to succeed. And you have to constantly in that system fight for your own humanity to be recognized. And I can certainly say I've experienced that time and time again. And I know many people have. And so when we look at the broad scope, of course, anti Blackness is the core of that. But you also spoke about the helping professions. And when I mentioned it, our professions were never intended to be rooted in anti-Blackness and anti-oppressive practices. If we
mm,
look at the foundation of social work, and I can use that as an example,
oh,
social work was founded by rich, well-to-do white women who had no need of money, but found this way of helping the deserving poor, that term and idea that came out
so
of the
good. That's
UK,
so good, Dr. Claire.
right? They came out of the UK and got embedded into
That's right.
American practices. And it said,
Mhm.
we will determine if you are deserving of this help.
That's
But
it.
when social work was founded,
Mm-mm-mm.
those women were not going into communities that look like us. And
Absolutely not.
today, our profession is still overwhelmingly white. And
That's right.
today, people still refuse to go into those communities.
Oh my
How is
goodness.
it that 100 years later, because this profession has been founded for over 100 years, we are in the same conditions? How is it that
Mm-mm-mm.
decades later, the same zip codes in New York City today are the same zip codes that were
Mm-mm-mm.
struggling with substance abuse, lack of funding, lack of resources, poor educational attainment, poor schools, underfunding for healthcare, underfunding for social services, high crime rates? It's the same communities.
Mm-mm-mm. You know, Dr. Claire, you gave me goosebumps. So much. I'm like, this really is so. I gotta say this, and this has been something that's been. I'm a Black woman CEO, and running, in a nonprofit organization going on 11 years. We've been when blessed enough to serve over 30,000 families and continuing to expand. But I can tell you, it is not easy when we are in this industry, this nonprofit, helping profession. You know, you start to think, you talked about that 1% of contracts going to Black businesses. Well, the same is true in nonprofit world. So I think sometimes we don't realize that that happens in the nonprofit sector. In the
Mhm.
nonprofit sector, there is a huge monopoly crisis going on where funds, large government contracts are being distributed to white-led nonprofits who don't
Absolutely.
know what our communities need, who have been around since the early 1900s, God knows doing what, because we weren't getting those services. And so it's really, it really excuse me, it perpetrates this very vicious cycle.
Mhm.
And for me, as a CEO, once again, I am consistently required to perform all these services, or my staff or my organization, for very little, for a penny. We're like, well, how are we going to make this work for a penny? We got to pay all these people and then do all this stuff. And then we look at, those larger known nonprofits that have been around for God knows how long, whose board, by the way, is all white men,
Mhm.
who has the connections and has the access to major philanthropists and has access to all these resources that are able to perform, that are doing a fraction of the work that we do.
Absolutely.
And it's very disconcerting. And so when you talk about, okay, what's going on with these communities that are still impacted in terms of the statistics, why are they still performing at those levels? I'm going to tell you, I believe that a lot of what we see today is repackaged slavery. I believe
Absolutely.
a lot of the programs in the name of interventions are just repackaged slavery. Because if we looked at the numbers and we looked at the statistics and we looked at, when you're looking at where the money is moving and what organizations are receiving these funds and what they're required to do, these problems should have already been solved. We've
Yep.
pushed billions of dollars into these organizations that are white led to solve these problems, and they have not yet been solved.
Mhm.
Why? Because there's a real another issue going on that we do not talk about, and that is systemic racism that shows up in nonprofit sector. It exists more than I believe it shows up in corporate America.
I mean, it's the foundation of it, right? We're talking about the foundations. And when we talk about the systemic racism inherent in all of these spaces, whether it be social work or not, social work has a long way to go to reckon with its history of systemic racism and oppression. But this is why I'm speaking about it here, because I am a Black woman who is leading a social work organization. And despite people's comfort or not, to your point, we cannot ignore the realities of what it is. And that is seen and replicated in every system. I need to remind people that social workers were a big part of removing Indigenous children from their homes and forcing
That's
them
right.
into to
Absolutely.
Christian-based schools, and robbing people of their culture, their language, their people.
That's right.
I want to remind people that social workers were a big part of going into Black communities and Hispanic communities and checking to see whether or not men existed in those homes. Because if men were in the homes and there were shoes at the door that looked like men's shoes, they were not eligible for the support they need for basic human needs like food, and
Mm-mm.
continue to help support the breaking up of families. So
Yes.
we cannot have this one dimensional rainbows and unicorn view of social work and our profession and the helping professions. I want to remind people that mental health has been deeply rooted in racism, and terms like
Mm-mm.
schizophrenia go back to the 1800s when a Dr. Cartwright described something called dryptomania, which essentially said that slaves had mental illness because they tried to run away, and it was
Oh
probably
my
because
goodness.
their slave masters were too nice to them, and so it
Mm-mm.
justified them, and that was written into medical codes
My
and
goodness.
books until the early 1900s. And I
Mm.
want to remind people that the way that we understand schizophrenia today is still rooted in drapetomania, because until
Mm.
schizophrenia was seen as a Black disease, it was seen as a white disease deserving of treatment and care, and people were in facilities. And it was the civil rights movement where we
Mm.
see the change and the shift in the diagnostic criteria of schizophrenia, moving away from a disease where people were looked at as docile and ignorant and in needing of help, and the angry, aggressive Black male stereotype coinciding with the rise of first generation medications, the advertisements, and then we see the over policing of mental health. And this is why today we have Black men, Black kids, Black youth. There's a reason why Black boys are 6 times more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD than their white counterparts.
That's right.
There is a reason why Black men are more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia than white counterparts.
That's right.
Schizophrenia goes all the way back. I mean, biblically speaking, and I know not everybody watching is Christian, but if I read the Bible